Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our U.S. Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. Today is Sunday, April 5th, 2026. And of course, this time of year, tax season is upon most of us who reside in the United States, and it is a less than pleasant time of year for many, as we have to essentially take stock of what income we earned over the preceding years, collect all of the various tax forms, submit a tax return, and the income tax is not the only tax that Americans are subject to. We're subject to property taxes if we own homes, or even if we own businesses. We are subject to gasoline taxes, we are subject to payroll taxes, we are subject to gift taxes, and of course the businesses that employ us or whose products we purchase are subject to their own taxes, and we have to pay sales tax when we purchase the products of those businesses. And there are lots of smaller obscure taxes that we encounter if we have various special circumstances. So the current tax system in the United States is a morass. It is nearly impossible for an educated layperson to navigate unless that person has the simplest possible tax situations. In most other cases, people have to hire professionals just to determine the extent of their tax obligation. And it does not have to be that way. And today we are going to explore a proposal that was actually made in the 19th century by one Henry George. Henry George was a political theorist, an economist, a journalist. Here is a portrait of him. You can see he has something in common with many of us transhumanists, just visually, but he was quite a brilliant individual. He even ran for mayor of New York on 2 occasions, and on the first occasion, he actually received a higher vote count than Theodore Roosevelt, who also ran in the same year. This was 1886. Then he ran again in 1897, but unfortunately he died of a stroke while campaigning in 1897 at the age of 58. So Henry George died far too soon, and this is the case for a lot of historical figures, but he wrote this treatise among many others called Progress and Poverty, and this was published in 1879. It is available for free online. Here is the link to Progress and Poverty if you would like to download and read it. And here is the Wikipedia page for Henry George. So if you would like to learn more about him, read this Wikipedia page. But today's discussion will focus on his idea of the single land value tax. And our U.S. Transhumanist Party Director of Citizen and Community Science, Daniel Twedt, who also ran as our 2024 U.S. Vice Presidential candidate, will be presenting this idea. We're also joined by Art Ramon, our Director of Visual Art, who will be here managing the stream and also asking some questions along the way. And I will be here to offer a critique of the single land value tax and to defend a different approach to taxation that is expressed in Section 36 of the US Transhumanist Party platform, as well as discuss my thoughts about why ownership of land, private ownership of land, is important to maintain, and how, in my view, a rational system of private land ownership would look and operate. This is going to be a discussion, an exploration, a bit of an informal debate, but not a debate that will have winners or losers or judges as such. It's more of an intellectual exchange, and the goal isn't to defeat or prevail over the other point of view, but rather to explore these ideas with some rigor and present alternatives to the status quo. I think both Daniel's position and my position, as we are going to articulate it today, is far superior to the morass and the almost inscrutable complexity of today's approach to taxation in the United States. So, with that introduction, Daniel, welcome. You have the floor. Please tell us anything you would like about the Georgist single land value tax and any related ideas of Henry George that you find appealing.
Yeah, well, George was sort of the singular American progressive from what's often called the progressive era, which I think World War I kind of derailed all the talk of progressive era thinking off the map. But I think progress is important. You know, the word progress is in progressive, you know, and we should be re-examining these ideas, probably because you've never heard of Henry George or Georgism. You may have played the game Monopoly, which actually was stolen from a student of Henry George who originally called it the landlord's game. And it was designed to teach people, you know, the absurdity and the tyranny of rent-seeking behavior. That's the kind of behavior where you're not doing anything productive. You're doing something like gobbling up a monopoly on something, and then, boy, once you've got the monopoly, you're in the catbird seat. You can charge whatever you want. there's a meme of modern day Henry George, because we need to. I mean, the people that do endorse Georgism, or Geoism as it's also called. I kind of like the term Geoism because it's you say Georgism, it kind of sounds like a little bit of a culty thing. You know, we're going to name everyone George. But Geoism is you know, geo is land, it's earth. So the idea is that not all property is created equal. You know, there are things that you create from your labor, and there are things that are pre-existing, like land, natural sources, air, water, and it should be a common treasury. These things that everyone needs to live should not be monopolizable and able to be charged exorbitant prices to access. Now, there's a lot of ways that this could be accomplished. There's no single path to the single tax, you might say. I mean, we have property tax already, which kind of is a land rent, because if you don't pay your property tax, guess what happens? Your property reverts back to the government, goes to a tax sale of some kind, and someone else gets a crack at using it. And I think another reason that geoist concepts are not widely known about is they involve somewhat weird sounding ideas like usufruct. I mean, you probably have never heard of usufructuary. That's essentially when you're allowed to use something without diminishing it. You know, it's kind of a tenant farmer is a usufructor. He's farming on the land. He's keeping the profits he makes from farming the land, but the title to the land is not his. And then there's another idea of something called a Pigovian tax, which is something that's not accounted for in the marketplace, like a polluter might be levied a Pigovian tax to make up for the damage they're causing with their pollution. And actually, one of the good things about geoism is that people wouldn't be polluting, because that would be reducing the value of their investment. But it's not like you would have to be kicked off your land and the title would go into some, obscure common bureaucracy. It would be a kind of a marketplace. In fact, it's also called land capitalism. You would renew your title or your lease on your land, perhaps in an auction, because the value of land fluctuates based on a lot of factors. Usually land in cities is more valuable than land out in the country, because people value being proximate to all these cool things that cities have to offer. So I think the highest priced real estate in the world is Tokyo. I think, or it's also the most populated. But there are places where Georgist, geoist, single tax ideas are quite successful. Singapore is an example. Alaska is an example. They have, and then the city of Pittsburgh, I think, is structured around Georgist tax models. But the nice thing about the land tax is it's a single tax, and you don't pay any other taxes. This could fund all the functions of government, police, courts, defense, etc. And you can't hide from the tax. You can't take your land and move it overseas. Obviously, it's going to be very easy to see who is using what land and who gets the bill for the land value tax. Now, I was thinking one good thing about the highly complex tax system we have now is, think of the armies of bureaucrats and accountants and pencil pushers, that it's kind of a jobs program for them. But I don't think that's a good reason to keep it in place. So it's the idea that there's personal property, and then there's public property, let's say, and the commons should be a common treasury for all. This is quite possible to do, and really we're going to need to modify our relationship to property, especially as we move off the planet, because you've only got so many positions around the sun that can absorb sunlight. Once you let's say you're building a Dyson sphere, well, you've blocked off the sunlight. you're shading the person behind you. So obviously there should be a usage tax for sunlight. Things like nature, we don't know how to duplicate the closed cycle ecosystem of Earth, so we should consider it an irreplaceable life support system, which it is, and that's a common treasury, and it should be treated as such. And we can create dividend streams out of these things that we all need and use and keep life going. So there was actually, I was mentioning that World War I kind of derailed the progressive movement, but at the time in the 1890s, there was an actual campaign badge for the geoist idea, and this was based on "Have you seen the cat?" It was a congressman that likened understanding Georgism to seeing a cat in the landscape. It's kind of interesting because it's kind of like those hidden picture things. But yeah, I think it's plausible to consider that you haven't heard of geoism or Georgism, because most of the people making the laws are actually receiving great incomes from being landlords, doing nothing but engaging in this rent-seeking behavior, where they're not producing productive things, but they're just gambling on the scarcity of an asset. And that's not a good way to run a society or an economy or a civilization. So I think the American experiment is inherently an anti-monopolistic one. It's inherently decentralist. It's inherently an open source experiment, and geoism satisfies all of these things. And it's something that both the left and the right can generally see the harmony of and even agree on. Even Milton Friedman called the single tax, the land value tax. He said that's the least bad tax. And Karl Marx said of Georgism, "Oh, this is just the last attempt of capitalism to save itself." But he grudgingly admitted that there were elements of Georgism that even met with his approval. He said, "Well, this is actually kind of like part of the Communist Manifesto," but I don't think it should be dismissed as a socialist idea. I think it is land capitalism. It actually creates a more vibrant kind of free market environment. I think you'd see things like businesses in people's front yards, even if we had a very robust Georgist idea. And there's a concept in economics called dead weight loss, where you're not extracting all the value from something. Here's a little chart which kind of explains dead weight loss. I don't know if it's understandable, but it's when you don't have the price points of the buyer and the seller. They're artificially kept separated. Like let's say you were selling 10-cent nails for 60 cents each, but you had a monopoly on them. So there would be this dead weight loss where people wouldn't be buying nails because they can't make a profit building houses with expensive nails. So this is an analogy of how land policies are holding back the economy. And it's probably the biggest thing we could do to just stop the housing shortage and revive the economy and stop taxing things that we like people being productive. It's the only taxism that penalizes something that actually deserves to be penalized, and that is the monopolization of useful land, and for that matter, other natural resources. So there's countries where you don't get to own land. I think Mexico, you get a 99-year lease on land. Technically, you don't have like an unlimited dynastic kind of title to something. So yeah, it could be thought of as part of the No Kings movement, because there's huge tracts of land in the UK, for example, that are monopolized by royalty because they get to go fox hunting and horseback riding, and it's really unfair to keep a common resource out of the hands of individuals when it's necessary for life. So anyway, that was kind of a rambling overview of why we need geoist policies, but the question is, how do we implement them? And this is a thorny legal question. There's lots of different ways to implement it. I mean, we already have property tax right now, so it could really just be done by modifying the property tax policies in some cases. But I would implore you to check out Geoism. It's something you probably. Oh, and I think I posted what I saw recently. I thought it was one of the best short documentaries of it's got kind of a gloomy title, The Best Idea That Will Never Happen. But the YouTube creator, Brit Monkey, he's got hundreds of thousands of fans and subscribers and views. So I think it shows in his production value of that. And then, as I said, there's ways to implement geoist ideas that don't rely on changing the law. And one of those is a business plan to reduce taxation and create a UBI, and that's called a Fierce. I think I've got the link that Gennady has. Maybe he can pop that up in the chat. Or so. Oh, you know what? I should be looking at the YouTube comments here. I had the StreamYard on private chat. So yeah, looks like we're getting some good comments out there. So anyway, happy Easter. I hope the single tax, the land value tax, resurrects from the dead on this Easter day, and I hope your tax burden of paperwork makes you think twice about a simple single tax that has been far too long neglected.
All right, thank you, Daniel. And would you like to share the quotations about Henry George that you prepared, or about the geoist concept more generally?
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of great minds in history that have heard about Georgism, geoism, and have been converts to the idea. You can pop up some of those if you want. There's a great one, Helen Keller, who reads, she'll find in Henry George's philosophy a rare beauty and power of inspiration, and a splendid faith in the essential nobility of human nature. Helen Keller, they're waxing quite spiritual almost. Einstein said, our generation especially has many and important things to learn from Henry George. Go Einstein. Churchill, roads are made, streets are made, services are improved, electric light turns night into day, water is brought from reservoirs 100 miles off in the mountains, and all the while the landlord sits still. There's a good comment about rent-seeking behavior. Henry Ford, oh no, I'm sorry, that's Bertrand Russell. He said he has always been an admirer of Henry George. There's Henry Ford. His quote about George, every American family can have a piece of land. We ought to tax all idle land the way Henry George said. Tax it heavily so that its owners would have to make it productive. Even Martin Luther King Jr., Henry George anticipated this state of affairs. We are likely to find that the problem of housing and education, instead of preceding the elimination of poverty, will themselves be affected if poverty is first abolished. And here we have the great economist Frederick Hayek. It was a lay enthusiasm for Henry George which led me to economics. I think he's the author of The Road to Serfdom, if I recall. George Orwell, who wrote 1984, had this quote, which I love. The landlord has no function and no excuse for existence. He is merely a person who has found a way of milking the public while giving nothing in return. That is literally all he does, except to draw his income. And then Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the Taiwan Chinese the Republic, not the People's Republic of China, but the Republic of China, which is now in the island of Taiwan. He said, the teachings of your single taxer, Henry George, will be the basis of our program of reform. And then one of our presidents, Rutherford B. Hayes, fully to know the evil is the first step towards reaching its eradication. Henry George is strong when he portrays the rottenness of the present system. And here's the brother of the founder of transhumanism, Aldous, Julian's brother. Quote, in this utopian community, economics would be decentralist and Henry Georgian, politics Kropotkinesque and cooperative. And here's, I'm sorry, can you read the name?
This is H.G. Wells.
Oh, this is H.G. Wells, yeah. And H.G. Wells said, Henry George's book came in like a laboratory demonstration to revivify a general theory with his extremely simplified and plausible story of the progressive appropriation of land. And here's David Lloyd George, no relation to Henry. The land question in the towns bears upon overcrowding. It is all very well to produce housing of working class bills. They will never be effective until you tackle the taxation of land values.
And we have two quotations that predated Henry George, but you may still want to discuss their relationship.
Yeah, well, these ideas really go far back, but Jefferson had to say on this issue, another means of silently lessening the inequality of landed property is to exempt all from taxation below a certain point and to tax the higher portions of property in geometrical progression as they rise. There he's talking about the ground rent of not the improved part of the property. And Ben Franklin, one of my favorite transhumanists, quote, they who had obtained a monopoly of the soil consequently ought to bear the whole charge of every treaty for such purposes, as the profit was to be wholly theirs. So yeah, these ideas go back really to Confucius, to Bible figures, to the idea of a jubilee every 7 years and 50 years, forgiving debts. I mean, the land is not made by people, and even Native Americans. There's in the Great Lakes area, there's a tribe where they had the two-row wampum, which means you stay in your canoe and I'll stay in my canoe. This was the I forget the name of the tribe, but it's a foundation of actually the American democracy and our Constitution. And you can't deprive people of what they need for living, because that's just slavery by other means. And that's why we desperately need reform of our relationship with common property.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel, for that overview. And before we transition to my remarks, I will highlight some of the comments that we have received at this time, because our viewers have been quite engaged. So first of all, Mike Lazine wonders, how did this debate come to be? Were we debating on this topic on Facebook, Discord, email, or by some other means? Well, I think we just noticed a theme that the Georgist ideas kept coming up in our salons and our discussions. And on Discord, there was some conversation about Section 36 of the US Transhumanist Party Platform, which proposes a different approach to taxation that I will discuss. And some members wanted to essentially revisit our stance on taxation. And I thought that a discussion of this sort would be the best way to do it, to just thoroughly explore the ideas, discuss the advantages, the disadvantages, various nuances, engage with our members. And the timing is appropriate as well, given what many of us are dealing with right now with filing tax returns. So thank you, Michael, for that question. Guildsman Pirate writes, one benefit to a land value tax is that it is a pro-privacy tax. How much land is being used, that is what you owe on. No punishment for improving property, no mass data collection on homeowners, and that is an under-discussed angle in his view. As well, he writes, land is naturally made. No one is making more of it aside from reclamation, and it is in finite supply, as opposed to taxation on one's fruit of one's labor. It is paying to use the land as one does. Then Suburban Bourbon 841 writes, if Woody Guthrie was still alive, this discussion may have provided some fodder for a new song. And Mike Lazine discusses some of the hardships of renting property these days. He says his mom and he rents their place, and that has its own problems, such as losing your home that you rent if the landlord decides to sell the place, causing people to become homeless. And landlords also have the power to add to our homeless problem by selling a property that was being rented. So Michael supports a transition away from that system, but he says he would be supportive of landlords giving renters at least 1 to 2 years to move if they're going to sell a property, instead of what many do, which is telling a renter to move with no true fair notice. And that's a fair observation, because sometimes a tenant decides to rent, say, an apartment or a house from a landlord, and the tenant is adhering to the terms of the arrangement. So the tenant is paying the rent, the tenant is taking care of whatever elements of that property the tenant could reasonably be expected to care for. But then the landlord may have other plans. The landlord may decide, oh, I want to sell this building to another entity, or something even, let's say, less dramatic, like I have a relative who is ailing and needs to move in instead of the tenant. Sorry, tenant, but you have to go. And that is understandable, but for the tenant, it's quite difficult in those cases to have to move
And if I
when
can jump
the
in
tenant
on
was
that
not planning to. Go ahead.
And if there is a auction type market periodically, like let's say every year, the property lease comes up for bid, there's nothing to stop people from forming tenant owned or owned housing. You could have GoFundMe's. I mean, your landlord would not have a monopoly on the lease. He would have to compete in the free market, and it's I'm a big fan of worker-owned cooperatives as well. This would be sort of the equivalent of a worker-owned cooperative, which actually this is kind of how the fierce business plan works, that the link you posted earlier. So yeah, there is incentive for people to own the thing that is primary in their life, and there's no prohibition against that happening.
Yes, thank you for that clarification, Daniel. And I would say it is an important question. How does one make sure, to the greatest extent possible, that people who made provisions to have a stable place to live, so they did what they thought they were supposed to do in order to make that happen, and if they had obligations to others, they satisfied those obligations, how do we make sure that they do have that reliable place to live, that they don't have the metaphorical rug pulled out from under them? I think any sort of system pertaining to how land is treated, how taxation is treated, needs to have a solution to that question. Now,
And it would also put a proper market value on, say, owning a vessel or like a seastead, because you can't have that taken away from you. I guess. Well, the Department of War Crimes could blow it up out of the water, but if that doesn't happen, that's another option. I mean, there's millions of people living in nomadic RVs right now, and probably almost as big a number living independently on the high seas and in boats that they own. And you would definitely be the owner of a vehicle or a vessel. That's not touched by the Georgist land tax system. So that's my comment on that.
All right, thank you. And it would be interesting too to consider what would the status of, say, seasteads or artificial platforms be under a Georgist system, because a seastead isn't naturally occurring land. And even if you, say, put a concrete platform in the ocean, as has happened, for instance, the Principality of Sealand off the coast of the UK started out as an ocean fortress platform during World War II, and then it was abandoned by the British government, and Captain Roy Bates, who later became Prince Roy Bates of the Principality of Sealand, essentially occupied it. He had a pirate radio station for our friends from the Pirate Party, and he declared it to be its own jurisdiction, the Principality of Sealand. You can see a bit vaguely in the golden frame behind me is my title of nobility from the Principality of Sealand. So I am officially a baron of the Principality of Sealand since the year 2012, and I obtained this title in the old-fashioned way that people used to obtain titles of nobility, that is, by purchasing it from the Principality of Sealand. So I think that's an interesting question. If you don't have land as such, if you just have a platform on the ocean, or maybe in the future some sort of floating platform, or if you have a space station, does that get subject to the single land value tax? But moving on to some of our viewer comments. So Guildsman Pirate responds to Mike Lazine in terms of the issues with landlords potentially evicting people. He's saying under a Georgia single land value tax, that's not necessarily the case. It just becomes not profitable to be a landlord and disincentivizes landlordship as a primary income. There will always be people looking to rent, but this promotes home ownership. I would say with a caveat that people don't really own the land underneath their homes in the Georgist system. They own the improvements. So that would be the structure of the home, any outbuildings, anything they do to the land. So anything they install, maybe statuary, decorative, garden elements, things of that nature, but they don't own the land underneath the home on which it is situated. Now, Mike Lazine notes in California, where he resides, most homes are about $500,000 on the low side, and that is really on the low side for California. Not a lot of Californians who are not rich can afford that, and so most Californians are perpetual renters. And at the same time, many apartments are super expensive to rent, and homes are extremely expensive to rent in California. So to live comfortably in California, one needs at least $5,000 or more per month. So thank you for that perspective, Michael. And Gilsman Pirate says the land value tax should incentivize land to be used properly and most profitably. There would still be landlords, just not landlords with multiple properties controlling rents. No corporations owning family homes. So he believes this would be more of a situation where the landlords would be natural persons or small businesses, and there would be more of a power symmetry between landlords and tenants. And to conclude the comments for now, I will also pull up once again the link to this A Fierce website that Daniel shared. It calls itself a new economic system that transitions from debt-based capitalism to land-based capitalism. So with that being said, now is the time for my critique of the single land value tax.
Could I mention one other
Yes.
point before you start?
Okay.
The big selling point is the citizens' dividend. So all of the land value tax that was left over when you've paid for all the essentials of government, that goes back to the citizens of the country. Just like Alaska has the permanent dividend fund, so that's almost like a UBI kind of arrangement. So yeah, and then just imagine you're not paying any other taxes. This is the only tax you pay, and it's just on the raw land rent. So and don't forget that citizens dividend, which I know we're a big that's a big part of our platform, is a universal basic income, which I'm pretty sure that Geoism would supply. But please go ahead with your critique.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel. And I'll preface the critique by saying I do have a great deal of respect for Henry George, and his views do align with mine on various other issues. For instance, he was a staunch free trade advocate and an opponent of protectionism. He would have some fairly scathing things to say about the current haphazard and arbitrary tariff policies that the United States is imposing. He has stated, for instance, that tariffs amount to waging war on one's own citizens by other means, essentially replicating the effects of a hostile blockade from a foreign power. And that really is what they do. They deny the citizens or residents of a country the ability to access foreign goods, or at least reduce the supply of foreign goods that could be accessed in the same way that a blockade by a foreign power might have done. And Henry George was a champion of civil liberties. He was a champion of rational electoral reforms, of the secret ballot. As I mentioned, he ran for mayor of New York City twice on a platform that was quite decent. So my disagreement with the single land value tax is not an opposition to Henry George's thinking as a whole. And furthermore, I do think that a Georgia system of taxation would be an improvement over the status quo, because the status quo doesn't have any sort of rationality behind it. And because of the myriad of disparate taxes that exist in the status quo, we essentially get the worst of all worlds. So I think we do get something that is worse today than a Georgist single land value tax, and that is the property tax, because the property tax isn't just a tax on the land or the portion that comes from nature. It's a tax on everything. It's a tax on the improvements, and the more improvements you have, the more you get taxed on potentially. I remember when I was a college student, I attended college in Hillsdale, Michigan, and there was a nice restaurant, inexpensive, called the Hillsdale Garden Restaurant. And the Hillsdale Garden Restaurant, you could go in there and get a meal for under $10. Fairly healthy food as well, and very nicely decorated too. But it turns out the city of Hillsdale went after the owner of the restaurant because there were essentially too many nice wall hangings and pictures and other decorative objects, and the owner did not declare and pay property taxes on those decorative elements. And that was just so draconian, such a minute imposition on the restaurant, that the owner decided to close up shop and move to the nearby town of Coldwater and open up the Coldwater Garden Restaurant, where the authorities perhaps were a bit more lenient about the property tax. But I thought at the time, taxing decorations is just so absurd. You could see behind me, if that were the case in the area where I lived, I would be paying an inordinate amount of property tax, and clearly I would not want to do that. So I think any taxation system that moves away from taxing either man-made property or the fruits of people's labor is a significant step forward. And along those lines, I would say if a Georgia single land value tax were implemented today, it would be a net improvement over the status quo. But is it really the best system, or does it have certain flaws that are quite concerning? And that's where my critique is focused. But first, I want to articulate what I am in favor of, and that is the system expressed in Section 36 of the U.S. Transhumanist Party Platform. This was adopted on May 7th through 13th of 2017 by a vote of our members, and it was amended incrementally during the vote that concluded on March 10th, 2025. And it reads, the United States Transhumanist Party supports the elimination of graduated taxation and income taxation more generally. Instead, the United States Transhumanist Party advocates a flat percentage of sales tax applicable only to purchases from businesses whose combined nationwide revenues from all affiliates exceed a specified threshold. This tax would not be imposed on life necessities, defined as goods that are consumable in the near term and whose primary purpose is to facilitate human survival. This tax should be built into the price of goods from such large businesses and should not impede transaction efficiency in any manner. Transactions pertaining to wages, salaries, gifts, donations, barter, employee benefits, and inheritances should remain completely untaxed, as should transactions involving solely individuals and or small businesses, for whom the establishment of a tax reporting infrastructure would be onerous. Furthermore, all taxes on land and property should be abolished. So you can see from that last sentence, this is quite a different approach and really not compatible with the Georgia single land value tax, because Section 36 of the USTP platform calls for abolishing all taxes on land or property. So really, the debate would be between a single tax on land values on the unimproved land and a single flat percentage of sales tax, but only applying to certain transactions. And there are some critiques of the sales tax, including the idea that the sales tax burden falls disproportionately on poorer individuals for whom, say, the fraction of their budget in expenditures on food or clothing is greater than for wealthier individuals. And that's addressed by exempting life necessities, one can discuss what would be considered life necessities. Say, does eating out at a fancy restaurant constitute a life necessity? Does buying luxury brands of clothing constitute life necessities? But nonetheless, I think in 90% of cases, reasonable people will agree on what are life necessities and what could be exempted from this tax. Furthermore, exempting small businesses from remitting the sales tax, businesses that don't have the sales tax infrastructure set up, would mean that only the businesses that already remit sales tax and are already quite adept at doing it would be doing it under this system. So say if you go to the Walmart will add a certain percentage for the state or local sales tax to your transaction and will remit that to the relevant authorities. And the Walmart is quite adept at doing that. It has many decades of experience at doing that. So this single flat percentage of sales tax would just be remitted to the federal government in this case through that already existing infrastructure. And people who want to reduce their tax burden may choose to patronize smaller businesses under a certain threshold of revenue, say under $1 million, but that threshold can be set based on the economic conditions at that time. And what that would mean, again, people of lesser means might be able to have a lower tax burden by patronizing more small businesses or local businesses. And they might also have a lesser tax burden if they are small business owners themselves. So the advantage of that tax system is that it's seamless. It gets paid automatically. If you go to a large store or patronize any sort of large corporations' goods or any sort of large-scale service that they offer, that sales tax will be levied, and you don't have to exert any effort. You don't have to report what your income was. You don't have to even, say, under a land value tax system, have some way of differentiating between the unimproved portion of the land and the improvements. So under the land value tax, there will still have to be a bureaucracy to determine, well, how much of the value is attributable to the land itself versus the man-made improvements. If you've built a house, for instance, and that house has appreciated in market value, how much of the appreciation is due to the structure that you've built versus how much of it is attributable to the land itself, because let's say there's more demand in that area and more people have moved in, so there's more competition. People might be bidding up the price of land in that area. So how do you differentiate between the two? It's probably a question that is solvable, but it would be administratively complex versus a sales tax system that would essentially already have a built-in mechanism of administration, because Walmart, Target, Best Buy, other large corporations have been remitting these sales taxes for many decades. And in my view, the most important aspect of a tax system isn't even the amount of the tax, it is how seamless it is for individuals. So the current tax system is the most labyrinthine one that anyone could invent if they tried inventing it, because of how convoluted not paying a certain proportion of one's income is, but defining what constitutes income and all of the many deductions, credits, exemptions, and then exceptions to the exceptions that exist that most laypersons cannot effectively navigate. And that creates a tremendous burden. And many people spend inordinate amounts of time filing their income tax returns. Worse, the current system distorts economic activity. I think the Georgists would agree with this point, because if you have to worry about paying taxes on your income, you might make different decisions about what money you earn, or whether you choose not to work or not to pursue certain arrangements or not to obtain certain assets if the taxation is too complicated. So sometimes people practice legal tax avoidance by changing their life situations in an effort to get more favorable treatment via the tax code. But doing that is suboptimal, to say the least. If you could have made a better choice objectively in the physical world related to your well-being, but the tax code makes that choice very difficult to afford financially, then you might make a choice that is less favorable for you, but results in a more reasonable tax burden. So my case in favor of an alternative approach to land ownership is found in a three-part article series that I wrote back in 2012. And I will provide a brief overview of this series to express why I think that it is important to have private land ownership and how a rational system of private land ownership would be structured. So part one discusses arguments for land as property. Part two is my analysis of the Georgist land value tax. And part three is my outline of a rational system of land ownership. This is a system based on libertarian or classical liberal premises, such as the first-occupier principle that was articulated by John Locke most famously. And John Locke held that the person who first takes land out of the state of nature and transforms it using his or her own labor is the legitimate owner of that land. So you can't just declare yourself to be a landowner like the kings of England did, per Daniel's example. You have to actually do something to transform that land with your labor, and you're only entitled to own that portion of the land which you transform, of course, as the first owner, as the first occupier. And then you would have a system of contracts that could enable the transfer of land to subsequent owners. And Mike Lazine asks, is that small L libertarianism? Yes, so it's not affiliated with the capital L Libertarian Party or any other formal libertarian institution. So first, I will discuss why land ownership is important. And there are multiple reasons that I put forward in part one of my series, The Vital Importance of Property in Land. First of all, the use of personal property requires a place to put it. So if there's no property in land, one cannot be guaranteed the ability to set one's personal property in any location for its use and enjoyment. And ultimately, that means the use and enjoyment of one's personal property is always at the discretion and with the permission of whichever governing authority or collective decision-making body would supplant the right of private property in land. So in a Georgist system, it might be the case that people are not the owners of the land, but there's some sort of collective management of that land. So it might be said the community owns the land, or there's some land trust, but there would have to be some administration of it. So some group of people is going to make decisions over how that land may or may not be used. What is the status of that land? And this is not true liberty. The best it can be is a kind of benign neglect from the persons or communities who have the power to dispose of the land and what is on it. Mike Lazine gave the example of a landlord being able to tell a tenant, well, I'm sorry, but you have to go, even if you've previously paid your rent on time. And there's a vulnerability there in the Georgist system as well. The collective land management entity could, in some circumstances, say to even the person who improved that land, well, we're sorry, but there could be a different use to that land that we prefer. Now, complete ownership, being able to use land free and clear without paying some sort of rent or usage fee to someone is extremely important. So today, in principle, it's possible for people to pay off their mortgages on their property, pay off any liens, or otherwise discharge any liens that they have on their property, and they own that property free and clear. Now, the big exception is property tax, which is why we in the U.S. Transhumanist Party oppose that as well, because you still owe property tax to your local governing entity, the county where you reside or the city where you reside. And I would say that is also a departure from this ideal of being able to own something completely, being able to own it free and clear. So any of my critiques of Georgism apply to the status quo as well, and even to a greater extent. But if you don't pay a continuous stream of money to a third party, both under the status quo and under a Georgist system, you could lose your ability to use that property. And the greatest value of private property, in my view, comes about precisely when the ownership of that property is absolute, when it's not contingent upon future services or payments rendered to other people. And what that allows one to do is the opportunity to choose leisure or to choose work, however one sees fit or whatever one is able to do. Because if there's no property and land, then one has to continuously and inescapably pay a stream of money to a third party in order to avoid losing the property. And that means one needs to continuously earn a sizable income to support that stream of payments. And that means that for a lot of people, certainly a lot of people in California, as Mike Lazine describes, the ability to lead a life of leisure after making adequate provision for other needs is forever closed off unless one is fortunate enough to have a trust fund or a passive income or have an investment strategy that really worked out well. But some people, of course, are in situations where they really can't work to a certain extent because, say, their health conditions don't allow it. They may be older. And so it would be great to have a system that allows them the unencumbered enjoyment of their property if they are in those circumstances, because whatever the relative merits of work versus leisure might be in a particular situation, for some people work might be preferable to leisure, but I, as a small L libertarian, hold that people should have that choice. People shouldn't be forced to work if they don't have to work. And likewise, they shouldn't be barred from working, and work shouldn't be made economically disadvantageous to them if they want to work. And this is where I would prefer the income tax to be replaced. And then restrictive institutions should not permanently foreclose individuals from pursuing any of those alternatives. So if people have the ambition to pay off their mortgage and live on a piece of land or in a house free and clear, they should have the realistic opportunity to do that. And then what are the incentives for improvement if one doesn't own the underlying land? I understand the Georgia single land value tax doesn't tax the improvements. So if you have a piece of land, whether you have a residential home on it or a skyscraper on it, you'll be paying presumably the same amount of tax for the land unless the demand for that land increases and then the tax rises proportional to the market value of the land itself. But if you don't own the land, you have less of an incentive to improve it because you might not capture the entire value of the improvements. So if you have, say, a piece of land and you decide to build a skyscraper on it instead of a single-story house, well, actually, maybe by doing that, you make your area more popular and more people flock to it. And, oh, the price of land gets bid up. So yes, you don't pay taxes on your skyscraper, technically speaking, but your land used to be worth $100,000 and now it's worth $5 million, and you do pay taxes on the $5 million market value that's attributed to the land. So this could be a situation where a so-called positive externality is not realized. If that skyscraper would have been beneficial to people in the area and it doesn't get built, then we do have a situation where essentially there are some economic gains that are not to be had. And alternatively, there could be a tragedy of the commons situation arising, because if the community owns land, or if the community owns any resource, there's sometimes a tendency for that resource to be overexploited and insufficiently well maintained. So a public road is sometimes subject to a tragedy of the commons, in the sense that, well, we see there are a lot of potholes on roads. Many roads are insufficiently well maintained, or the maintenance is subject to political favoritism. A lot of vehicles use the roads, and say large vehicles, big trucks, can go on the roads, damage the roads to a greater extent than smaller vehicles, but there's no clear delineation of the share of responsibility that a given individual bears for the usage of the roads. There have, of course, been classic examples of overfishing or hunting of wild game to extinction in common areas as contrasted with privately owned areas. So some economists have even suggested having private ownership of marine life or of wilderness areas, where then the private owner could restrict overfishing or overhunting so that those species do not become endangered or extinct. Then, of course, there is the benefit of individual expression. So if you truly own your property, you can imbue it with your distinctive aesthetic. True private property enables an individual to act within his or her own realm as he or she pleases, as long as that person does not infringe on the identical prerogatives of others to do the same with their property. And only if you have unfettered private property and land can you truly be free to paint your house with the colors that you choose, or determine your landscaping, or determine the appliances or the amenities that you put on that property. And this is a right, of course, that is commonly infringed today by homeowners associations, which in many cases have these draconian busybody requirements that, oh, you can only paint your house a certain color, or you may only plant these particular plants. And that, I would say, is not a justified encumbrance. An individual who owns land can truly turn the land and improvements on it into reflections of himself, rather than just another barren, drab, or cookie cutter plot. And yes, that may lead to some unconventional choices among individuals, but those unconventional choices are sometimes what is necessary for innovation to occur and for new aesthetic possibilities to emerge. And what worries me under any system where land is owned in common is that some institution will have a veto power over those choices, just like homeowners associations do today. And again, homeowners associations are not governmental institutions. They are technically private bodies, but they exercise quasi-governmental powers in ways that would make many advocates of freedom quite concerned. And then I think it's important to note, in terms of how to distinguish owned land versus land in the state of nature. So one big Georgist concern or complaint is that a lot of large landlords or large institutions come to own vast amounts of land, and they simply assert a claim to it. Like the king says, this is all my land, I'm going to use it for hunting. Or even the US federal government today lays claim to a lot of land in the Western United States that is completely undeveloped, unused for any sort of purpose. And this is not the view of land ownership that I hold. So again, I agree with John Locke that your legitimate claim to land extends to what you could transform with your labor and put to use, or acquire in voluntary exchange from other people who have done that. And if there's land left over, and there's a lot of land that is left over after that, that undeveloped land is part of the state of nature, and people should have the right to claim it. They should have the right to homestead it, which would, of course, lead to more opportunities for people to develop that land, to build homes on it, to actually improve their standards of living, and to lead home prices to fall, which we need them to fall urgently after the tremendous price appreciation of the last 15 years, which has led entire generations of people to be priced out of the opportunity of home ownership. And indeed, one might point to countries in Latin America where there are a lot of squatters, because there's a lot of undeveloped land owned by essentially large estates that were left over from the colonial period. And the owners of those estates did not develop the land and have no intention of doing that. But over generations, squatters have settled on that land, and they've built little homes there. They don't have property rights. They don't have title to those homes. So it's difficult to obtain any capital or any ways to improve those homes, but they do live there. And a rational small L libertarian system of property ownership would actually give them title to those homes. So it would recognize those particular squatters, not just people who barge into somebody's existing home or improved land, but who have lived on unimproved land for a long time. After a certain period of time, it would be legitimate to consider them to have homesteaded that land and have a legitimate ownership claim. So I'll make some more points about the Georgist land value tax in particular, because the concept of a Pigovian tax was mentioned, and the Pigovian tax idea actually originated after Henry George by A.C. Pigou, a British economist of the early 20th century, but the Georgist land value tax idea was interpreted in retrospect as being a Pigovian tax. And essentially, a Pigovian tax is meant to get people to pay for negative externalities that their activity ostensibly inflicts on the external world, on the society. So, for instance, a classic idea of a Pigovian tax would be a tax on pollution. If you pollute a certain amount, you pay a tax to reflect the damage that you are imposing upon the rest of your neighbors or your community. So some have, for instance, suggested Pigovian taxes, like carbon taxes, for entities that produce carbon emissions that contribute to climate change. So having laid out the Pigovian tax idea, I'm quite skeptical of it in general, because it seems rather contrived. It seems that anyone imposing a Pigovian tax would need to have some sort of perfect knowledge about the extent of that negative effect and the second order or third order consequences that would arise from it. And a taxing authority just does not have that kind of information, even with AI or Google Maps or various disparate sources of information that come to a tax authority. I don't think any human would be able to rationally calculate what that negative incidence arising from a particular activity is going to be. Say, take the case of climate change. How much do the carbon emissions from one coal-fired plant actually contribute to increases in even what? It's not even the average global temperature that would be of critical importance from the standpoint of how much damage is done. It would be the impact on a particular locality, how much likelier are natural disasters of certain sorts, severe storms or droughts going to be because of that particular coal-powered plant. I would say that's pretty much impossible to calculate. And likewise, if the idea is that landlordship imposes negative externalities on the rest of the community, how do you calculate that in a proportionate manner to really be able to fairly impose a tax on this? So the economic distortions of taxation relative to a tax-free situation, of course, cannot be avoided in practice no matter what form that tax takes. But we need to pay attention to what taxes may produce greater distortions or different kinds of distortions than others. And then, of course, the concern is anytime we talk about social cost or what social costs an activity imposes, that could easily be manipulated by lobbyists, special interest groups that could influence politicians to change the tax law and say, well, look, really the social cost is whatever our special interest group doesn't like, and the social benefit is whatever we like. So we need to make sure that the tax is imposed on those people whose ostensible imposition of social cost we don't like, and the benefit is collected by our favored groups or constituents. So that's always the risk. Now, the Georgist system, again, it may be less prone to that than the status quo. The elimination of other possible taxes would be a definite advantage, but in practice, what we have in the United States today is the result of attempts to introduce ever newer taxes, but they haven't replaced the prior taxes. They've been added on top of the prior taxes. And the property tax system that exists today is, I would say, more extreme than a Georgist land value tax, but it has arisen precisely in that incremental fashion. So we need to be careful in this regard, because today that tax is paid along the income, sales, excise, gift, estate, fuel, and numerous other taxes. So they're all paid by most individuals, not to mention fees that fund various government services. But let's assume that it's politically feasible to impose a single land value tax. And let's assume also that the government is completely benevolent and actually wants to save people money and actually even brings about a lower total tax burden, a lower tax rate. So the best of conceivable worlds with a single land value tax. There are still some problems, and we need to consider what can a person do if a person wants to avoid taxes entirely. So let's say you're a property owning individual, you want to avoid taxes entirely. Can you avoid income tax? Yes, you don't have to earn income if you have enough saved up to live on. Let's say you want to avoid sales tax. Well, you can if you don't purchase any goods from anyone, if you grow your own food, for instance, and you have enough other goods saved up that you want to live on. You can avoid gift taxes by not giving gifts or not giving gifts beyond the tax-exempt amounts. And so if you keep largely to yourself, if you own your own house, if you have enough tangible property saved up, if you grow your own food, you don't have to pay any of those other taxes. But a land or property tax, you cannot avoid. So no matter what you do, your stock of wealth will diminish through taxation. And that, I would say, is a problem for someone. So if someone just wants to live a kind of peaceful life, not be particularly involved in society, that taxation system will say, tough luck, you have to earn an income now, or you have to get wealth from other sources now in order to pay this tax, because if you don't pay this tax on your land, then you lose the right to use the land. And of course, all of your improvements, all of your personal property are on that land. So where do you go? Maybe you could move your house if it's a mobile home, technically speaking, though it's difficult to do. Maybe you could take it apart, disassemble it, assemble it somewhere else. Very difficult to do. But then you will probably end up renting from somebody else. So that's a concern. And I would say that is a phenomenon that a rational system of taxation should strive to avoid. Now, some might say, well, a Georgist land value tax would encourage the vertical improvements, so have land put to better use, have more urban density in areas that need it, in areas that need more housing. And that may well be, despite the caveats that I mentioned earlier. But I think it could also lead to a situation which would be quite strange, where there would be large amounts of land that are completely unoccupied, unused, unowned, because nobody wants to pay the tax on them. So you might have a situation where you would have like a vast empty field, and in the middle of it, you would have a cluster of skyscrapers or other high density buildings. And next to it, you would have barely anything at all, because there would be just a few landowners. They might want to pay the tax on relatively small plots of land, but not that many people would want to spread out and have smaller homes or farms or ranches. So lower density development, which is generally associated with higher quality of life. Because if you have lower density development, you'd have to pay higher land value taxes on that. And then one could also conceive of a rather suboptimal outcome of the single land value tax, and that would be the result of a perverse incentive indeed, where most individuals decide that it's not worth the trouble to own land because they could avoid taxes if they choose to not own land. They would rather be tenants if the rent is initially affordable enough. But then large landholding corporations would emerge and purchase most of all, or all of the land, because the corporations might decide, well, we have enough money, we have some spare capital to deploy, we can afford to pay that tax, whereas for a natural person, it might be too onerous. So this is a scenario that's counter to the claim that large landlords or landholders would disappear. I could actually see a single land value tax favoring the large landholders, because a large corporation could decide, okay, the tax is a cost of doing business, we can absorb it, but we have billions of other dollars. Whereas an ordinary citizen, or what would today be a small landlord, might decide, well, it's just not worth it. I'll rent instead. And then we have a situation where many of those corporations are owned by dispersed shareholders, and there are principal agent problems between the shareholders and the management. So the shareholders are just there essentially to collect their dividends, or however the corporation distributes its profits. So the shareholders are satisfied as long as the corporation pays a steady stream of dividends. The management is satisfied as long as the management is entrenched and has the ability to direct the assets of the corporation, pay themselves large amounts of money. And what the management would then do is just keep buying up land and renting it out, which is the status quo situation, at least according to the Georgists, that they criticize with corporate landlords. And in that situation, of course, people are beholden to a minority of landowners or lien holders by means of payment of rent, or today they have to repay expensive mortgages. So this, I think, is a problematic situation. And one significant downside is what I mentioned: the possibility of free and clear ownership of property would be more definitively off limits to everybody, even in theory. So if you don't own the land, even if you pay off your mortgage, you don't own the land. Sorry about that. And if you have these great landholding corporations emerge that do own the land, they could behave like the supercharged homeowners associations in terms of micromanaging people's lives, imposing arbitrary restraints on the use of personal property and the improvement of land. And they'd be able to conduct this abuse with impunity, because there would be fewer of them in any given geographical area compared to today's homeowners associations. I think this scenario should be of concern to people of a Georgist persuasion. And I'll note one key point on taxation. So any sort of correction that a market may try to bring about for the economic distortions that are the result of any tax policy will always be imperfect. So if a tax redistributes, in effect, either income or economic activity, the market will try to route around that, but it will not be able to do that 100%. And the deadweight loss that Daniel measured that arises from various systems of taxation as well, or from monopoly power, is a reason for why the market can't perfectly route around those distorting effects. So changing the tax structure can't really solve that problem by itself. And what can solve this problem to a certain extent is just by lowering the overall tax burden. So there could be situations where I would say, okay, the Georgist land value tax is something we could consider if it results in a vastly lower overall tax burden on individuals, because then that would give them more resources to actually solve those problems rather than essentially having to route around them suboptimally. So if somebody said, okay, we'll replace all other taxes with a Georgist land value tax of 0.5% of the estimated value of the land, however you calculate it, I would probably say, okay, as a pragmatic approach, that's acceptable. But I think the debate we're having is in regard to more of a hypothetical revenue neutral situation where you replace all of the taxes with either the Georgist land value tax or this single percentage of sales tax that the USTP platform advocates. And I'll say a few more points about the rational system of land ownership that I articulate in the third installment of my series. I've already mentioned the first-occupier principle and how you actually need to use the land in order to assert the first right of ownership for it. And if you have this system, then the owned land is truly owned. It's free of any encumbrances that the owner hasn't voluntarily entered into. Now, you could still have contracts that say, okay, I am granting somebody else the use of this land as a tenant, or somebody might have a lien on the land. If you take out money to purchase a house, then you have a mortgage, then the lender has a lien on that land and on that house. So that, of course, exists today, and that would still exist under that system. The first occupier of the land would have some prerogative with regard to negative externalities. So say if you're a homesteader and you've lived in an area for 15 years and somebody else comes in and wants to set up a polluting factory nearby, you would actually have some right to prevent that from happening or to require compensation because you were there first and you didn't sign up for the polluting factory being next to you. But if the owner of the polluting factory came there first and it was a barren piece of land before that, and a new person moves in and says, oh, I want to build a luxury mansion here and I want my kids to live here and go to kindergarten here, you need to stop polluting from your factory, then you wouldn't have the prerogative to force that factory owner to stop just because you want to move in next door. There would be a recognition that the factory owner was there first. And of course, as I mentioned, under the system that I advocate, there would be no property tax of any sort. And the concept of ownership would not inextricably be tied with any ongoing payment unless the property was purchased by means of assuming a debt obligation. So private debt obligations may still exist, but there would be a bit of a modification in the sense that foreclosure today can occur if you miss one payment. But to me, that never made rational sense, because if you miss one payment, but you've made, say, a few hundred payments, you have equity in that home. You shouldn't lose all of your accumulated equity just because you missed one payment. if you are late on your mortgage, for instance, your equity should then dwindle until it dwindles down to zero if you fail to make payments. And then the bank or other lender could say, well, now we own your home free and clear. Sorry, but you have to go. But that would give the mortgage payer a lot of time to actually become current on their payments. So the vast majority of the foreclosures that occurred, say, in the wake of the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis would not be legitimate under that system. And there could be easements on land as well that the owner agrees to. So instead of eminent domain, instead of the forced taking of property, parcels of land could come with certain easements, such as right-of-way easements. And again, whoever developed that land first can build in an easement and say, okay, there's a right-of-way easement here for utilities or for a road. And if you purchase this piece of land, you have to agree that a road may be built here or through your property, or there could be improvements to the utility infrastructure. So that could be agreed upon by contract as well. And there could also be cooperatives. There could be, for instance, a group of small business owners that get together and say, we want to purchase the land around our establishments, and we could create sidewalks there. We could create maybe a nice park that people could go to so that people would enjoy coming to our places of business and moving from one business to another. There could also be a category that the economist and philosopher Roderick Long called common land. So it's neither publicly owned land nor any more privately owned land, but it's land that used to be privately owned that the private owner decides to make available for general public use in some irrevocable manner. So a good example could be, say, a lot of the parks along the waterfront of Chicago that were actually given to the city by previous private owners. But you could have a situation where it's not publicly owned as such. There would be a contract governing the use of the land. So a landowner might say, well, I want this area to be essentially a park or a trail that members of the public could go through. And these are the conditions. And I will not be able to further restrict those uses, but I might set up some sort of mechanism to make sure that people don't litter on the trails or something like that. So that kind of system is very much conceivable. And you could have a system even of private land trusts that purchase land and encourage the construction of housing on that land, and they would have a mission that's not purely profit maximizing. They could say their mission is to enable affordable housing. So the people who live there, maybe they might pay some amount of rent, but it would be limited. Or they might have some obligation to help maintain it, but it would be limited. And the rent could be lower than the current market rates of rent, provided that there are owners or cooperative organizations that are willing to do that. So all of that is compatible with the system, the small L libertarian system of land ownership that I've articulated. And there could be discussions about, say, how far up does that go in terms of airspace? How much right to privacy do you have from, say, an aircraft flying 10,000 feet overhead? How far down does that extend in terms of mineral rights? So my article discusses that a bit. But hopefully I've outlined an alternative to the Georgist land value tax, as well as why private ownership of land is important, particularly for individuals. So you can see from my points that I'm not really on the side of large landholding corporations. I'm on the side of individual homeowners and small business owners who should have some opportunity to own land free and clear. And I'll conclude my remarks there. We have a lot of engagement in the chat, but Daniel, I'll give the floor to you first for any sort of questions, comments, rebuttals regarding what I said.
Well, as usual, you made many excellent points. The current system we have now of taxes and ownership is a morass of layers upon layers of things that were probably never thought out from first principles. We obviously didn't do first principles thinking. I guess we didn't have a chance to when we set up land ownership and taxation systems. But I mean, I heard you mention at one point there that you have this payment ongoing payment to a third party, so you're going to lose your land. Well, that's property tax. We have that now. But I am intrigued by the idea of free and clear ownership in perpetuity. I mean, because property tax, you don't really own the land, you're renting it from the government. And also additionally, the government can come in and do eminent domain, say, hey, we have a better use for your land, we're going to put a freeway here or a pipeline, whatever. So but as land is a limited commodity, you're denying the commons. A private owner is by definition denying someone else the ability to access this resource, and that is an opportunity cost that's lost. That's an unpriced externality, and it has a lot of repercussions. So there's lots of different ways you can implement Georgist ideas. And I think the best way is to have you're contracting with the free market for a use of a limited resource. I mean, that's how we should look at it. I mean, I look at the current taxation platform of the Transhumanist Party, and I think, my God, this is going to create a huge counter-economic black market. There's going to be an army of bureaucrats having to, determine all these uses of what's taxed and what not to tax and how to enforce it. And the elegance of the land value tax is there's no way to evade it. It's all mappable. You can see who's doing what with the land, where and when, and you can account for this very elegantly. And I think eliminating these masses of bureaucrats and armed people that will come and extract the payment by force. I mean, that is a huge anti-libertarian thing, to having to have this huge taxation, bureaucracy and army. So I think we're not weighing all the advantages and disadvantages as thoroughly as I would like in this discussion, but maybe AI will help with that. There was a comment recently I heard, I think it was Elon Musk said, we'll probably end up with socialism on Earth and free enterprise in space. I think that was what his visualization was, the potential outcome, because Earth is so limited and space is so unlimited. I mean, that might be how it shakes out. There's a saying, the meek shall inherit the earth because the bold will be leaving it. And I think that's a great pro space expansion slogan. But yeah, we should definitely keep in mind a full accounting of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, when we talk about taxation systems and land use systems. So I'll land my comments there.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And I will respond in regard to the tax bureaucracy. So I do advocate approaches to taxation that reduce the amount of bureaucratic enforcement needed, and also the amount of discretion needed to determine what is taxable or not. And this is where I think we have a difference, because you think that the single land value tax will essentially bring about a system where the tax is unavoidable and you know what it is, you know who owns the land, etc. But I did pose this problem for the single land value tax, which is, how do you legitimately distinguish between the value of the unimproved land versus the value of the improvements, particularly in a market that's characterized by increasing demand for both? So let's say somebody builds that skyscraper on a small plot of land, and then that helps to revitalize the economy in that area. So a lot of people come in, and then that person, the skyscraper owner, ends up paying more in taxes. But what proportion of that market value increase is attributable to the value of the land versus the skyscraper and other improvements. You might need some bureaucrats to determine that. Now, on the percentage of sales tax system, the advantage is that any sort of bureaucracy around it already exists. So states and localities levy the sales taxes, and large businesses comply with that. And they comply with that even in situations where life necessities are exempted. So, for instance, in Nevada, if you purchase food from a grocery store, not food at a restaurant, food from a grocery store, that's not taxed. That's not subject to sales tax. If you go to a restaurant, that's still subject to sales tax. So there could be some nuance about what is a life necessity that I mentioned. But that could also be spelled out sufficiently in advance that the large businesses know what those exempt goods are, and they have their systems set up accordingly because they know how to set up those systems. They know how to set up a system that says, remit tax on this item, do not remit tax on this other item. On the other hand, a small business, so let's say you are an artist and you go to one of these art fairs and you want to sell your paintings or your prints or your sculptures. A lot of artists do that. And technically, you're supposed to pay sales tax on that. You might just be a person with a little safe deposit box, and that's how you collect cash. Maybe you accept some sort of online payments as well, but you have to then fill out forms to account for how much sales tax you've collected from each transaction. You have to keep track of that. You have to remit that to a state or local government today. That is challenging for a lot of people. So that's where the bureaucracy around sales tax really becomes the most onerous. But by saying the sales tax is only subject to corporations, not natural persons, that have revenue above a certain threshold, and it would be a sufficiently large threshold that a single artist or a small business owner, family farm, a small coffee shop would not exceed that threshold, then what you have is essentially just the existing bureaucracy, if that. But you wouldn't have this new set of imposition. So that's where I think the difference is. Now, Daniel asks, why even tax things that we want to incentivize? It's morally and economically contradictory. I do agree with that. I actually think one thing Nevada as a state does right is that it has a gambling tax. So that's more of a kind of vice tax or sin tax, as it's called. I do not gamble myself. I am perfectly fine with the state's revenues being bolstered by this type of gaming or gambling activity. From my standpoint, of course, the expected value of these games is negative, and therefore I will not engage in them. But if others wish to engage in them and also support the funding of the state of Nevada, I would be in favor of that. So I'm generally more sympathetic toward these kinds of, let's call them sin taxes, as long as one doesn't go overboard. One can go overboard with them if they become such a huge source of revenue to the government that the government starts wanting to encourage that behavior in order to collect the taxes on it. And a good example is state-owned vodka during the Russian Empire, because the Russian Empire actually had a monopoly on vodka, and it produced the vodka. It actually offered it fairly inexpensively to the peasants and other ordinary residents. And of course, it benefited from heavy taxation of the vodka, but it also created a culture of alcoholism and a life expectancy problem among Russian males. So Russian males, especially during times of economic hardship, tend to drink themselves to death. And this was a legacy that was manifested during the fall of the Soviet Union, where, because of the economic chaos and collapse that ensued, the life expectancy of Russian males fell into the 50s, while the female life expectancy stayed in the 70s. So you don't want to have too many sin taxes to essentially encourage the activities in question. But I would say some amount of such taxes would be reasonable. Again, it's less reasonable to tax something that you want to actually encourage. Jason Geringer points out the vodka thing is a good example, but the state also uses that culture of alcoholism as a form of control. Yes, exactly. So indeed, the Age of Enlightenment was a revolt against that, because during the Age of Enlightenment, people actually started drinking coffee and tea, beverages that stimulated rational thinking as opposed to stultifying it. And Mike Lazine asks, gambling goes with bodily autonomy, right? My money and I can spend it how I wish as long as it's legal. Yes, so I would support that, and libertarians would support that. I would just say, from the standpoint of rational financial calculation, gambling doesn't make sense unless you're good at counting cards or you're good at some of those games of skill. So I am more accepting of taxation of that than I would be of taxation of productive economic activity. Kevin Branciforti writes, it is interesting to note that Henry George lived prior to the advent of the income tax, aside from the temporary income tax to fund the Civil War. And our current income tax is the brainchild of the so-called progressive Woodrow Wilson. Yes, that is correct. So the income tax, I would say, is a worse tax in various respects, because the income tax is necessarily accompanied by a great deal of complexity, not in terms of the amount of the tax, though you could set the tax so high that you discourage productive work, but in terms of what constitutes income. So if you have a job with an employer or a large organization of some sort, generally you would just get your W-2 form every year and your employer will calculate your income for you. So that's a fairly easy tax filing situation. But if you're self-employed and you earn a variety of income streams, you earn royalties, you earn payments for contract work, you earn payments for selling art, for example, that becomes much more complicated. And if you own assets, if you own stocks that pay dividends, if you purchase other kinds of income earning assets, your tax situation could become extremely complicated. And technically, the IRS even considers barter transactions to be taxable, which I find to be unconscionable, but that is the IRS's position, because they try to figure out every which way that people could avoid an income tax burden and then slap a tax on that potentially avoiding activity. So I do think that it's possible that a Georgist tax system would be an improvement over the income tax system that we have today. Now, Daniel said, land capitalism will determine the contractual usage rate from the common treasury. Perhaps, Daniel, you might want to expand on that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways that Georgia's land value tax or ground rent could be implemented. Like I said, you could have a lease negotiation on eBay. Every year there could be, like we have tax day now, we could have lease negotiation day, and all of these different contractual points could be up for auction. And this is the essence of libertarian free marketism, is people will act as intelligent, rational actors, to accumulate plus factors and minimize minus factors. That's the beauty of free human action. And I'm not saying that there would be this flat, everyone's going to pay, 10% property tax every year, or you got to give up your land title. I think there's lots of, well, again, going back to the a fierce plan, that that is totally implementable outside of changing any laws. It can be done simply by intentional communities buying up, tracts of land with this common business proposal. And in fact, there's groups like the Nature Conservancy that keeps Earth wild by putting it into these conservation trusts arrangements. So I think it's wrong to just think Georgism is going to be this one size fits all, percentage tax. And you're right to point out, how do you calculate the value of the ground itself versus the value of the improvements? I think these are questions that, given enough marketplace intelligence, can be addressed. But yeah, I do like the term land capitalism. I think, because a lot of people think, oh, Georgism, that's just some crackpot socialist idea. No, it's more capitalist than socialist, I think. But maybe that answers the question a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. And we have a question from Kevin Bransaforty in regard to entities. I think the entity itself is called Blackstone, that owns various one-family houses, turns them into rentals. How specifically would a land value tax stop this? So the scenario that I actually posited was that it might not stop this. There could be these large landholding corporations that would buy up land precisely because they can afford to pay the tax, and ordinary people might see the tax as more of a burden. So you could have a large corporate landlord that decides, okay, we're going to take on this land tax, purchase all this land, and all the houses on it will be rented out. So, Daniel, what do you think? How would a single land value tax avert that scenario?
Well, you might have to get into the addressing of corporate personhood, actually, because I think it was William Jennings Bryan said, the challenge of the 20th century is the God made man or the man made God. He was referring to the legal, implementation of corporations as legal persons, because originally corporations used to have very limited charters. You could say, well, we want to build a mill on this stream, and we want to grind corn, so they would have a very specific charter written up to make a corporation to do something. But now corporations have become, especially with the Citizens United decision, they have unlimited, power to influence politics with money. I mean, we've really legalized political bribery in the last few decades. But yeah, how would we address these problems of corporations creating undesirable monopolies? I think you'd have to take that possibly on a case-by-case basis and adjust the policy in kind of an a la carte way to fix this. That's why it's the American experiment. It's unfinished. It's like Disneyland. It'll never be finished as long as there's imagination in the world. So these are good questions, though, and I'm glad that we have a forum here where we're giving them sunlight.
Indeed, very interesting questions to consider. By the way, Kevin also writes there are two versions of monopoly. One is the landlord's game that we all know, and the second one is prosperity, which was influenced by Georgism. The rules should be distributed so libertarian kids can play. And again, we do have a screenshot of the original landlord's game by Elizabeth McGee Phillips from September 23rd, 1924. So this is what it looked like. There is a George Street there, actually, and a Progress Park. There is now a Progress Park in San Diego, by the way. It was recently built. It has some interesting statuary that I saw during my trip to San Diego in late March. But it's interesting to just observe the design of this board and the various spaces that exist on it. There's a space for land taxes, for personal property taxes, for improvement taxes. So that's interesting.
It exemplifies the citizens' dividend, because you pay all the rent gets paid into the middle of the board, free parking, and then when you pass go, you get your share of that common treasury back. So that's one way you can take an original Monopoly game and just with that tweak, you can kind of simulate the landlord's game a little bit. So instead of just $200 UBI, you've got a far greater UBI because all the rents are being divided equally because land is a common treasury.
Indeed. So we have some interesting comments by Kevin as well. His largest concern is he can't remember any time a new tax actually replaced an older tax. And this goes to my point of how we came to the morass of taxes that exists in the US today. He also writes in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Hot Black De Sato once spent a year dead for tax purposes. And that's interesting, but now they tax death as well through estate taxes. So it may be difficult to even avoid taxes there. He also writes, I once bought a 20 by 100 foot abandoned lot in New York City, covered with junk cars, garbage, and rats. After clearing, the city decided that I should be taxed on the best use as though the lot had a 3-bedroom house. So I do wonder if the land value taxes, especially in situations where the market value of the land or some sort of assessed value might be bid up because some people might think, oh, hypothetically, this could be put to that kind of use. If the land value taxes might become onerous as a result of that. And then Mike Lazine writes, what about how seamless it is to report taxes to the IRS? It would be nice if our taxes were a lot more simplified without many times needing someone like H&R Block to file. I agree. There have been various efforts even to establish a free tax filing system through the IRS, which would have saved a lot of people many hassles and certainly saved them the out-of-pocket costs of purchasing software from vendors like TurboTax or H&R Block. However, those tax preparation vendors have now become a special interest constituency, and they lobby to thwart any attempts to either simplify the tax system or to create free filing options for people. And there used to be a limited free filing option through the IRS, but even that got shut down. And now the Trump administration doesn't really have any sort of receptiveness to letting people file their own tax returns for free. So that's unfortunate. Now, Art Ramon, I wonder what questions or comments you would have regarding this discussion.
Switching. Go ahead and switch it, Gennady.
Yeah. Here you go.
Switched. No, it's kind of overwhelming, the whole tax situation. I try to think back, what happened before there was any government overseeing. It was like, well, you have a lot of tribalism, and you have people who are very, I'm forgetting the term. What's the term? Very territorial. So even back in the days when you had Native Americans next to each other, one would bully the other one into tribute, which would be like a tax. Give us stuff or we want to attack you. So there's always been tax of sorts, as long as there's always been some other person around to try and force it from you. So it all comes down to there's this entity that is going to subjugate over you and say, give me tribute. So as long as that exists, we're always going to have some form of tax, it seems. So I don't see any alternative. Try and find the best way that works for everyone without enriching a few who game the system. But yeah, it's great listening to all the different perspectives and everything. But to actually make change in the world, hopefully it will happen. When there's this conversion to this new economy that will one day come about through super abundance. So hopefully we see a lot of positivity on the other side.
Indeed. And Daniel posted this quotation. This was from Supreme Court Justice John Marshall in 1819. He wrote, "The power to tax is the power to destroy." And, well, taxation has had this kind of coercive basis ever since it came about. And there have been worse taxation systems than the one that exists. Actually, in England and in a lot of other European countries, there were these private tax collectors who were essentially given dispensation by the king or the king's officials to collect taxes in a certain area. And they only needed to remit a certain amount to the royal treasury. And whatever they collected in excess of that amount, they could keep themselves. So they had an incentive to really squeeze the people because they didn't have any sort of limit to what they could collect. They just had an obligation to remit taxes to the crown, and they didn't really have a rational basis on which to structure the taxes. So right now, there are formulas that one has to follow in terms of determining what the tax obligation is. One may agree or disagree with those formulas or quibble about whether life's circumstances fit one into this category or this other category for the purpose of a tax obligation. But the fact is, there are systems for determining that through some set of criteria, which may be more or less reasonable. Those private tax collectors just took what they could and kept the excess after remitting what the crown was seeking from them. And I would say that's a worse system. One could also conceive of a system that's not technically governmental, but in practice has a higher tax burden than a government would impose. So, of course, some sort of private gang, some sort of mafia protection money type of arrangement would be a de facto tax, but the mafia doesn't call itself the government. Still, that would be worse than a systematic approach to taxation that exists today. And I think your point is very well put, Art Ramon, that ultimately the solution to this is to create an economy of abundance where taxation itself might either become obsolete because it would be so easy for a government to operate without it, or it would just not be a big deal because what is left over after taxes are paid is such an immense amount of wealth that people could satisfy essentially all of their needs. The reason why we're talking about taxation now is because the tax burden is significant, it's not automatic, and it does lead people to make trade-offs in regard to their lives in terms of what they can or cannot do, what they must do relative to what they want to do, hence the points I made about people who would like to choose a life of leisure, but they have to work in order to pay property taxes, for instance. So hopefully that can be solved if we have an economy of automated abundance where, again, taxation might become a very insignificant portion of total economic activity. So I think we've had an excellent conversation today. We are approaching 2 hours, but Daniel, do you have any closing comments based on what has been said thus far?
Yeah, I think all these ideas are getting us to a post-coercion society, and one not just of abundance, but of freedom from oppression and coercion. And something along those lines I forgot to mention is a plan called Solar Dividends. I think it's solardividends.org, and that's a Professor Robert Staten's plan, and to set up a kind of a solar trust fund for everyone with solar panels that generate electricity for the community. And Bucky Fuller wanted us to have a currency based on the kilowatt hour, which would make sense. Then we could interconnect the day-night grids of the world and load balance between them and drop the price of electricity even further. But yeah, it's really important that we keep our eye on the coercion-free aspects of using our intelligence to make progress. And I recently saw a stat that per capita, the Chinese now have 1,000 watts per person of solar panels installed, and the U.S. is now only 800 watts per person. So get out there and set up those solar panels, and we can use that to fight coercion too. So anyway, go Mother Earth, go land, free the land. Thanks for the topic today.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel, for your comments and your engaging presentation. I think we definitely got people to think about the subject of taxation today. One comment that I'll highlight before we conclude is by Kevin Branciforte. He writes, I believe the clearest path to life extension for the highest percentage of humanity is increased home ownership. How can we incentivize more buildings of condos or co-ops rather than more apartments or more standalone homes as well? And Daniel also would like to share this link, solardividends.org. I will post it here so that you can check out the solar dividend proposal. And as I expected, I don't think we arrived at complete agreement on these questions. I don't think we arrived at a complete resolution as to which tax system is superior, and there are going to be differences of opinion among our U.S. Transhumanist Party members and among our viewers, but it is important to have this conversation and to continue to deliberate how could we have a society where essential services are provided, but people experience the most minimal burden of taxation that is possible. So in the words of More Life Please, John H., we'd better settle for coercion minimal rather than coercion free. He doesn't think that having a coercion free outcome is feasible today. Kevin Branciforte says he agrees, but at least having it be as seamless as possible and having the everyday experience of life experience as few distortions as possible from that. I think that's a worthwhile goal. And Luis Arroyo writes, this was informal. Bridges can be built through discussion between us transhumanists. Yes, I agree with that. And I think we're going to be having more of these kinds of conversations on issues that perhaps there would be significant disagreement on within the transhumanist community. This was a worthwhile experiment, and we will have others like it in the future. So thank you very much to everyone who attended. Thank you to Daniel for his thoughtful commentary and explaining more about Georgism for our audience. And thank you to Art Ramon as well for being here and for his comments. I hope that we can all live long and prosper.